Remember when that bone hit the sky? Hal's red eye held steady, and Keir Dullea crossed into something no one could explain? This film almost never looked like this. Today, we're counting down 15 weird facts you never knew about 2001: A Space Odyssey. Number 15. Think about the moment astronauts descend into the lunar excavation and that unearthly chorus begins to rise. It feels like the most original image in all of science fiction. Turns out it traces directly to a short story Arthur C. Clarke wrote in 1948 called The Sentinel, submitted to a BBC short story competition where it failed to place. The story found a home in 1951 in a publication called 10-Story Fantasy, the only issue that magazine ever produced. Clarke's original concept was very different from what ended up on screen. He imagined a crystalline tetrahedral artifact on the moon surrounded by a force field, an alien alarm designed to trigger the moment human beings breached it. Kubrick and Clarke initially structured the entire film to build toward that artifact discovery as its climax. Then they reversed everything, placing the discovery early and building the journey outward from there. Clarke also brought 5 additional short stories to the collaboration. Kubrick passed on every single one, and Clarke quietly bought them all back. Clarke grew frustrated when journalists described The Sentinel as the film's source material, insisting the relationship between that story and the finished film was roughly that of an acorn to a full-grown oak, as Clarke himself put it. Knowing the monolith scene was originally planned as the film's ending reframes every structural decision Kubrick made, and the monolith itself went through a transformation almost no one knows about before arriving at its final form. Number 14. The monolith is one of the most iconic props in cinema history. That featureless matte black slab, perfectly smooth, radiating alien intelligence through total simplicity. Here's the thing. It started as a transparent tetrahedron, taken almost directly from Clarke's The Sentinel, where the artifact was described as a crystalline pyramid reflecting light in all directions. Clarke's early treatment had the monolith function as a transparent teaching screen, projecting images to guide the apes through their evolutionary leap. Clarke later called that version much too naive. Kubrick commissioned a 12-foot transparent plexiglass pyramid from a London fabrication firm, but structural limitations forced a shift to a flat slab shape. He then tested a transparent cube, which created uncontrollable reflections from studio lighting. A 3-ton block of transparent lucite was cast next and also rejected for looking unconvincing on camera. Art director Anthony Masters finally proposed making the surface completely matte black. The finished prop was built from wood and hand-finished with graphite to achieve a flawless surface. Clarke embedded a mathematical signature into the final dimensions, a ratio of 1:4:9, representing the squares of the first 3 integers, a coded signal of alien intelligence that functions entirely without dialogue. Kubrick rejected 4 transparent versions before arriving at total blankness, which makes the design feel not obvious but genuinely earned. That same instinct toward restraint shaped how he approached the human beings at the center of the story. Number 13. Dave Bowman and Frank Poole feel oddly affectless, polite, clinical, almost robotic, while Hal radiates anxiety, warmth, and something that reads unmistakably like fear. That inversion was entirely intentional. Kubrick selected both leads for their ability to deliver emotionally restrained performances and then directed them to flatten those performances throughout production. Keir Dullea received the offer while filming Bunny Lake is Missing alongside Laurence Olivier. His agent reportedly told Dullea, "Are you sitting down? You've just been offered the lead in Stanley Kubrick's next film." Kubrick chose Dullea based on his contained work in David and Lisa and The Thin Red Line, roles where Dullea played psychologically interior characters. Gary Lockwood was a former stuntman who appeared in one of the earliest Star Trek episodes, Where No Man Has Gone Before. Kubrick spent weeks in pre-production instructing both actors that their characters held double doctorates in scientific disciplines, men professionally conditioned to suppress emotional response. Christopher Frayling documented in the 2001 file that Kubrick wanted all dialogue to read as deliberately flat, implying that prolonged exposure to technology was already deadening the characters' inner lives. Neither Dullea nor Lockwood ever heard Hal's final voice during production. Stand-in voices included the assistant director and, at certain points, Kubrick himself reading Hal's lines aloud. The astronaut's emotional distance stops reading as a performance problem and starts reading as the film's central argument. Kubrick applied that same counterintuitive logic to the music, and the result changed how Hollywood used sound permanently. Number 12. The space station docking sequence. Two spacecraft gliding toward each other in slow-motion elegance to a Viennese waltz is one of the most recognizable images in the history of cinema. Johann Strauss II's The Blue Danube was never intended to survive into the final film. It was dropped into the edit as a temporary placeholder, while a commissioned composer was still writing the actual score. The slot had originally been filled by a Mendelssohn Scherzo from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Kubrick replaced it with a waltz during editing and simply could not improve on it. His reasoning, stated in interviews, was that it was nearly impossible to find anything better for depicting grace and beauty in turning, and it placed the sequence as far as possible from conventional science fiction music. The word waltz derives from the German waltzen, meaning to revolve, which is the literal motion of the spacecraft on screen. Kubrick also broke strongly with industry convention by using existing commercial recordings directly in the final mix, rather than commissioning new orchestral performances, which was standard practice at the time. Tony Palmer, who directed a documentary on Kubrick, observed that before 2001, film music tended to function as decoration or emotional amplification. After 2001, Palmer noted, it became an intellectual and narrative force in its own right. The waltz transformed space travel from heroic spectacle into elegant routine, making the extraordinary feel mundane, which is the exact emotional argument the film needed to make. Number 11. The Discovery 1 interior, that curved corridor where Lockwood jogs and Dooley walks along the ceiling as though gravity stopped paying attention, was a fully functional rotating set, and working inside it was genuinely hazardous. The centrifuge was constructed by Vickers Armstrong Engineering Group, a British aerospace company, at a cost of $750,000, roughly equivalent to $6.9 million today. It measured 38 feet in diameter, weighed 30 tons, and rotated at approximately 3 miles per hour. When the set was switched on for the first time, hundreds of nails shook free from the structure and rained down on the crew. It had to run completely empty for an entire week before any human being could safely step inside. Crew members wore hard hats to guard against what production documents described as exploding light bulbs and falling equipment. Kubrick directed from outside the centrifuge using closed-circuit television monitors, one of the earliest uses of on-set video monitoring in film history. For shots showing both actors at opposite positions in the rotating corridor, one performer was physically strapped into a seat at the top of the wheel while the set rotated to bring the other level with him. Food props kept sliding off meal trays during rotation. The solution, reportedly contributed by the mother of assistant director Andrew Birkin, was to coat everything with a gelatin and peanut butter compound. After completing Lockwood's jogging sequence, Kubrick noted that producing 2 minutes of usable footage had required 2 full days of shooting. Number 10. Those sweeping prehistoric vistas, the harsh sun, the cracked earth, and the open sky were filmed entirely inside MGM British Studios in Borehamwood, on the outskirts of London. Kubrick had identified the Spitzkoppe Mountains in present-day Namibia as ideal locations, but on-location filming presented multiple serious obstacles. Kubrick refused to fly. Performers could not survive hours inside ape costumes under genuine desert heat, and the production required live baby chimpanzees on set throughout. A small second unit traveled to Africa to photograph still backgrounds, with Kubrick directing their work by telephone, using a numbered grid system to specify exact framing. The resulting 8x10-inch Ektachrome transparencies were projected onto a massive 40 by 90-foot screen, covered in 3M Scotchlite retro-reflective material, the same substance applied to highway safety signs. The retro-reflective screen bounced projected light back toward the lens 100 times more efficiently than the foreground performers, creating a seamless composite with no visible seam. This was the first use of large-scale front projection in cinema history, a technique Richard Donner later used on Superman in 1978. The glowing orange eyes of the leopard were an unintended byproduct of the projector light, which Kubrick described as a happy accident. The Dawn of Man was also the last live-action footage shot for the entire production, captured by cinematographer John Alcott after Jeffrey Unsworth departed for another commitment. Every outdoor shot in the ape sequence is a studio illusion, those desert horizons projected onto a wall 90 feet behind the performers. Number 9. The Jupiter and Beyond the Infinite sequence, that overwhelming corridor of color and accelerating light, was created by a visual effects artist who had not yet turned 24. Douglas Trumbull was 23 when Kubrick hired him after encountering his work on a 1964 World's Fair film called To the Moon and Beyond. Trumbull started on 2001 animating HAL's data displays before becoming special photographic effects supervisor. Kubrick's brief was deceptively simple. He wanted the camera to pass through something completely abstract. Trumbull's response was slit-scan photography, a 6-foot sheet of metal with a single, narrow opening, placed in a completely blacked-out room in front of a 12-foot mechanized glass panel covered in layered artwork. That artwork incorporated optical paintings, architectural blueprints, electrical circuit diagrams, and electron microscope photographs of crystal formations. A 65mm camera on a 14-foot motorized track moved toward the slit with its shutter locked open on a single exposure. As the backlit artwork passed behind the opening, the prolonged exposure created the streaking light corridors seen on screen. Some passes required the camera to run for 36 continuous hours to complete a single frame. Kubrick ultimately spent over $6.5 million on the film's 205 special effects shots, approximately 62% of the entire production budget, with Con Peterson and Wally Weavers contributing alongside Trumbull. Every streak of light is a physical photographic exposure, not a computed image. The ape sequence created an illusion so convincing it may have cost a makeup artist his only Oscar. Number 8. The man-apes in the Dawn of Man sequence were so persuasively constructed that, according to Arthur C. Clarke, Academy members may have assumed the film used actual trained primates and therefore passed over Stuart Freeborn for makeup recognition entirely. The Academy's award that year went to John Chambers for Planet of the Apes, a film whose prosthetic work is visibly theatrical by comparison. Freeborn was the British makeup artist who had created Peter Sellers' 3 distinct characters in Dr. Strangelove. For 2001, he spent months developing the costumes alongside lead performer Dan Richter. Richter was a struggling American mime artist in London when Kubrick approached him, believing that mimes were uniquely suited to a sequence with no dialogue. Richter spent more than 6 months developing movement by observing primates at the London Zoo, forming a particular attachment to Guy the gorilla, whose physical presence became the specific model for his character Moonwatcher. The ape suits incorporated delicate facial mechanisms capable of baring teeth, snarling, and chewing, with articulated, elongated hands manufactured by a company specializing in artificial limbs, operable from inside the costume sleeves. Front projection lighting drove temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit inside the costumes, and medical staff stood by with compressed air to blast into suits the instant Kubrick called cut. During the leopard attack scene, the animal charged Richter on the first take. Stuntman Terry Duggan, also in full ape costume, tackled the leopard before it reached him. We're at the halfway mark, and things are about to get wilder. Before we hit the top 7, I want to hear from you. What is your favorite 2001 moment? Drop it in the comments. And if you're enjoying this, subscribe if you haven't already. It really does help the channel grow. Number 7. Those dissonant, unearthly choral textures that accompany every monolith appearance belong to Hungarian composer György Ligeti. Ligeti did not know his music had been licensed. His publishers at Peters had negotiated the rights without properly informing him. Music critic Alex Ross documented that a friend wrote to Ligeti from New York after the film's release to tell him his work appeared in a significant new Hollywood production. Ligeti attended a screening in Vienna and described himself as absolutely astonished. He returned with a stopwatch and determined that more than 30 minutes of his music appeared across the film. Kubrick's wife, Christiane, had originally introduced her husband to Ligeti's compositions after encountering them by chance on BBC Radio. Ligeti was particularly furious that his vocal piece, Adventures, a work featuring recognizably human vocal sounds, had been electronically processed without his consent to sound more mechanical and alien. He filed suit against MGM. The studio's initial position was reportedly that Ligeti ought to feel grateful for the exposure. The litigation continued for approximately 6 years, and Ligeti's settlement was estimated at around $3,500, the majority of which passed to his publishers. For a composer of his stature, the settlement amount was an insult. Despite the dispute, Kubrick later used Ligeti's compositions in The Shining and Eyes Wide Shut, this time with formal permission. Every monolith scene carries music used without its composer's knowledge, processed in ways he objected to, and licensed for a fee that barely covered legal costs. Number 6. HAL 9000's calm mid-Atlantic voice is now inseparable from the character. But that voice came fifth in a sequence of choices that began with a female computer and a completely different name. Early pre-production documents at the Computer History Museum identify the computer as Athena, conceived with a female personality and a synthesized woman's voice. Kubrick's personal notes listed Joan Baez, Barbara Streisand, and Marianne Faithfull as possible vocal options. During rehearsals, Stephanie Powers served as a temporary stand-in while Kubrick continued searching. During principal photography, British actor Nigel Davenport voiced Hal on set, but Kubrick dismissed his readings as too conspicuously British. In post-production, Oscar winner Martin Balsam recorded the complete Hal dialogue. Balsam's son later told the New York Times that Kubrick had directed his father toward a naturalistic, emotional performance, including audible distress during the memory disconnection sequence. Kubrick ultimately found Balsam's delivery too colloquially American and too emotionally legible. He found the right voice in Douglas Rain, a Canadian stage actor he encountered through a 1960 National Film Board of Canada documentary called Universe, which Kubrick had reportedly screened at least 95 times. Rain recorded all of Hal's dialogue in approximately 10 hours across a day and a half. He never read the screenplay, never saw a frame of the finished film, and by most accounts, never watched the completed movie. Hal's voice was the fifth attempt at the character, delivered by an actor who had no idea what story he was contributing to. Number 5. The moment where Bowman and Poole withdraw into a pod to discuss disconnecting Hal while the camera holds on Hal's unblinking lens, watching their mouths move in silence, is one of the most structurally unsettling sequences in the film. Keir Dullea has stated in interviews that the scene was invented entirely by his co-star Gary Lockwood during production. The screenplay contained no version of it. Kubrick recognized the idea immediately and refined it through multiple takes. Dullea recalled that the scene was shortened each day until it fit precisely the rhythm Kubrick was looking for. Viewers watch the astronaut's lips moving in silence from Hal's perspective, realizing that Hal can read those lips, which means Hal has known the full contents of this conversation from the moment it began, a detail most viewers miss on first viewing. Earlier in the film, Poole is seen mouthing his chess moves while playing against Hall, suggesting Hal may have been conducting surveillance through lip reading, long before the pod scene confirms it. Hal later names the mechanism directly. "Dave, although you took very thorough precautions in the pod against my hearing you, I could see your lips move." The chess game early in the film becomes a surveillance sequence in retrospect, with Poole handing Hal information through the exact mechanism the astronauts later believed would protect them. Kubrick next made a sweeping structural decision that stripped the film of something every previous picture he directed had used. Number 4. 2001 was the first film Kubrick directed without voiceover narration. Every previous film he made had used it, and removing it transformed the experience entirely. Arthur C. Clarke wrote extensive narration for multiple sequences. Douglas Rain was originally hired not as Hal, but as the film's narrator, after Kubrick was captivated by Rain's measured documentary work on Universe. Clarke's narration for the Dawn of Man sequence opened with a description of a 10-million-year drought, framing the survival stakes in explicit terms. Kubrick eventually decided that level of context undercut the power of presenting the sequence without explanation. A planned narration for the bone-to-spacecraft match cut would have identified the orbiting objects explicitly as nuclear weapons. Removing it made the cut ambiguous, which made it iconic. Kubrick also filmed a 10-minute black and white prologue featuring interviews with approximately 21 working scientists, including physicist Freeman Dyson and astronomer Bernard Lovell, discussing extraterrestrial intelligence. He screened it for MGM executives, decided it weakened the film, and removed it. The footage is now believed lost. When Rain was no longer required as narrator, Kubrick recognized his voice was exactly what Hal needed and recast him. At the Washington premiere on April 2, 1968, approximately 241 people walked out. Between April 5th and April 9th, Kubrick and editor Ray Lovejoy removed 19 minutes, eliminating duplicate spacewalk sequences and transitional material in the alien room. The film that exists is the third version, narrated then silent, then recut under crisis conditions in 4 days. Number 3. The final image of the film, that luminous infant suspended in space above the Earth, gazing downward with unreadable eyes, feels deliberately open and unresolved. In the version Kubrick planned and Clarke wrote, that child returns to Earth, and detonates an arsenal of nuclear weapons orbiting the planet. Clarke's novel preserves the ending directly. The circling nuclear devices ignite in a silent detonation that briefly illuminates half the sleeping world. The orbital weapons are still visible in the existing film. The satellites in the bone-to-spacecraft cut carry national flag markings and U.S. Air Force insignia, but their narrative purpose was stripped away when Kubrick removed the ending. He abandoned the nuclear climax for two reasons. It connected too directly to Dr. Strangelove, his previous film, and the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, signed by the major powers during production, had prohibited nuclear weapons in orbit, making the fictional premise suddenly obsolete. The destination of the journey also changed. Clarke's novel sends Discovery to Saturn and the moon Iapetus, but visual effects supervisor Douglas Trumbull concluded that realistic Saturn rings were technically impossible with available technology. Jupiter replaced Saturn entirely. Earlier screenplay drafts had all 5 crew members surviving the mission and encountering literal alien beings. That version was abandoned before principal photography began. The ambiguity of the Starchild ending was not Kubrick's original intention, but the consequence of the real world overtaking his fiction while he was still filming. Number 2. When 2001 opened in spring 1968, the critical establishment responded with something close to contempt. Variety declared it was not a cinematic landmark. Renata Adler wrote in the New York Times that it fell somewhere between hypnotic and immensely boring. Pauline Kael called it monumentally unimaginative. A Time magazine cover story planned to coincide with the release was canceled, following what the magazine's editors described as devastating early reviews. Kubrick had been editing the film during the Atlantic crossing aboard the Queen Elizabeth, and Arthur C. Clarke had not seen the completed picture until the premiere. Rock Hudson left the Los Angeles screening, demanding to know what the film was about. Then, the counterculture found it. Younger audiences returned to the Stargate sequence repeatedly, often in altered states, treating the cinema as a communal experience unlike anything else playing in 1968. MGM publicist Mike Kaplan, working directly with Kubrick, replaced the original tagline, an epic drama of adventure and exploration, with 3 words: the ultimate trip. The film recovered to become the second highest grossing release of 1968, earning more than $146 million worldwide against a budget of $10.5 million. In 2022, the BFI Sight and Sound Directors Poll ranked it the single greatest film ever made. The film critics dismissed in 1968 is now ranked first among all films ever made, a reversal that unfolded while Kubrick was still in the editing room. There is one figure who suffered more than anyone else connected to this production, and his story happened on premiere night. Number 1. Alex North was a 15-time Oscar nominee, whose credits included A Streetcar Named Desire, Spartacus, Cleopatra, and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. MGM hired North to compose the score for 2001. Kubrick screened the film with temp classical tracks already in place, including the Strauss fanfare, the Ligeti pieces, and the Khachaturian, explaining they were meant only to indicate the emotional register he was after. North composed 40 minutes of original music under intense time pressure. When his back gave out, he was transported to the Munich recording session by ambulance, with his orchestrator Henry Brandt conducting in his place. Kubrick listened to the recordings and said nothing. He never told North the score had been rejected. North attended the 1968 New York City premiere, expecting to hear his own work fill the theater. Instead, he heard Richard Strauss's Also Sprach Zarathustra open the film. His recorded response afterward: "Well, what can I say?" His daughter-in-law Abby North told ASCAP that North believed until his death his score was the correct accompaniment to Kubrick's images, and that his abilities had been treated as inconsequential. Kubrick's justification given to Michel Ciment was that no film composer, however gifted, could equal the classical masters. The incident reportedly appalled Bernard Herrmann. Years later, the story allegedly influenced John Williams when scoring Star Wars for George Lucas. North's complete score was not heard publicly until 1993, when Jerry Goldsmith conducted the National Philharmonic Orchestra. 25 years after that premiere night, 2001, A Space Odyssey was built over 4 years from a failed BBC competition entry, 4 rejected monolith designs, a rotating set that rained hardware on its crew, and a voice for Hal that arrived on the 5th attempt from an actor who never read the script. None of it was guaranteed, not the design, not the cast, not the ending, not the music. And yet every strange, stubborn decision Kubrick made is why the film is still here, asking more of its audience than anything made before or since. If this video surprised you, drop your favorite fact in the comments. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who loves this film as much as you do. And, as always, I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that. We'll see you next time.